Good morning. I'm told that there are a variety of transportation issues out in the world today, and so we're starting a little bit late to accommodate those of you who are breathlessly running up from either the metro or the parking garage. Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Steve Grundman, the MA and George Lund Fellow here at the Council. The purpose of this morning's event is to hear from Sean Stackley, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. He'll talk about industry and government roles in Navy and Marine Corps acquisition and maybe some other things besides. Thanks very much, Sean, for taking the time to make this address and have a conversation with us. I also want to acknowledge the support of our partner in this series, what do we call this series? The Defense Industrial Policy Series. Our partner, National Defense Industrial Association, which is represented here today by NDIA's President and CEO, General Craig McKinley, right there, as well as its Chairman, General Arnold Punaro, whom I will prevail upon momentarily to introduce our featured speaker. Before we move to the substance of this afternoon's event, however, I want to make a couple of administrative notes. The agenda for our proceedings are pretty straightforward. The Assistant Secretary will speak for about a half hour, following which he and I will take these chairs for a short conversation, after which I will moderate questions from the audience. Please do note that the entire event is public on the record. Also, we are live streaming it over our website through one of these cameras here. So if I should call upon you to offer a question, please wait for one of our staff to bring you the microphone, identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question, and keep your questions brief and to the point, please. Also, I'm compelled to make note that we are tweeting the event at the hashtag ACScowcroft, and even can receive questions through that channel. If you send them in, our staff, and send a good one, our staff will bring it up to me on a little piece of paper. Finally, please note, we're going to conclude this event not later than 12:15, so please, as we approach that hour, pace your questions so that we can fit as many others in as we can before that hour approaches. Sean Stackley's address here today will be the 6th event in the Atlantic Council's Defense Industrial Policy Series. This series aims to create a preeminent platform from which public officials address government's stewardship of defense industrial resources. The series is an initiative of the Council's Scowcroft Center on International Security and a further expression of what its namesake, General Brent Scowcroft, had in mind for the center: the cultivation of a transatlantic constituency for strategic thinking about and practical solutions to the problems of international security throughout the globe. It is the public sector complement, this series is the public sector complement, if you will, to our Captains of Industry series, at which we hear business executives' perspectives on the public interests their companies serve and the public policies that shape their markets. The most recent previous event in this series was an address just last month by Philip Dunn, the United Kingdom's Minister for Defense Equipment Support and Technology. He made an address entitled Securing Operational Superiority Through Defense Innovation. And the series continues as soon as next week, when on the 14th of January, beginning at 4:30, the Secretary of the U.S. Air Force, Deborah James, will be making an address entitled Bending the Cost Curve. Please come back for that. I can hardly think of a more suitable suite of government executives to serve up some strategic thinking and practical solutions for government's stewardship of the defense industry and defense industrial resources more generally than the service acquisition executives of the 3 military departments. And you can rest assured that following Air Force Assistant Secretary Bill LaPlante's address here as part of this series last June, followed today by Sean Stackley's, the pressure is now on me and the Army to produce Assistant Secretary Heidi Shyu at some point during the year, which we'll be working to do. Now, I'd like to welcome General Arnold Punaro. The last time I welcomed General Arnold Punaro to the stage, he nearly pushed me off it before I could say some nice things about him. So it will suffice to say, welcome General Punaro, who's going to introduce Sean Stackley. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. And Sean is not going to let me give more than a 30-second introduction to him, so I'm going to use my time to talk about some of the major leadership changes that we're going to see in the department that Sean will be working with. And before I do that, we have the unexpected privilege and pleasure of having with us today in the audience the former chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the former Secretary of the Navy, a former naval combatant in World War II, a Marine in the Korean War, Chairman John Warner, Senator John Warner. And he's flanked by another former Secretary of the Navy and head of NASA and former chairman of the National Defense Industrial Association, the Honorable Sean O'Keefe. And although we didn't know you were coming, Senator Warner, I wore my Navy tie, and Sean Stackley wore his Marine tie, so we have your Navy Marine Corps team here in presence. And so we're thrilled to have John Warner, Sean O'Keefe. John Warner was part of every major positive change that has happened to our Department of Defense and our government for perhaps the last 50-some-odd years, serving in combat as a young seaman, serving as a captain in the Marine Corps in the Korean War. He served in the Department of Defense in one of what is considered the model for the leadership of the Pentagon, the Melvin Laird, David Packard, the Laird-Packard model. He then was partnered with my old boss, Senator Nunn, when we passed the Packard Commission reforms in 1986, along with the Goldwater-Nichols reform, chaired the committee and been involved. And the reason I bring this up is because we're getting ready to have a new Secretary of Defense in Ash Carter. I'd say, and we all know him pretty well, Ash Carter is probably as well prepared and as well qualified to go into that job as anyone we've seen in our lifetime, without question. He's been the top weapons buyer in the Pentagon, the head of AT&L. He's been the top management official in the Department of Defense as the deputy. He was the alter ego to Leon Panetta, so learned policy, but he grew up on the policy side, so he brings the acquisition, he brings the management, he brings the policy to the world's largest and most complex organization, of which Sean Stackley is a key part. You have taking over the two committees. We've all gone through, Chairman Warner, a number of changes. You have taking over in the House Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry. You have taken over in the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator John Warner. And people say, oh my goodness, we've got all these new kids taking over these committees. Between Mac Thornberry and John McCain, they've got over 60 years of experience on the two Armed Services Committee. John McCain's been on the SAS for 27 years. These are not people that they're very thoughtful, they're very objective, they're very knowledgeable. They both said very positive things about Secretary Carter, whose confirmation hearing will be the first week in February, as announced by Chairman McCain yesterday. Obviously, any nominee gets asked a lot of tough questions, some of which will be in Sean's bailiwick, but he'll do fine. He'll get confirmed easily in the Senate. I believe Chairman Warner would share that view. And will take over and be working in the acquisition area with probably, and I say this having been dealing with this for over 40 years, and we've got some great former acquisition executives here. I saw Dave Van Vuren earlier. But when you look at, as Ash Carter is the Secretary of Defense, Frank Kendall in the USD AT&L, you have in Sean Stackley and Bill LaPlante and Heidi Shue, when you put that team together, and that was actually the chain of command, the way the Packard Commission envisioned it, you know, the service acquisition executives of that area, probably the strongest acquisition team we've seen in the Pentagon as a collective group in a long, long time. And it's going to be the hot topic in the Congress. It's going to be, Frank and Sean and his colleagues are working well with the Congress and working well. Industry, we're heavily engaged in all these areas. So I'm very bullish and very optimistic about the coming year. Everybody's going to talk about the gloom and doom and the sequester this and the sequester that, but it's all about leadership. Ash Carter is going to be picking 4 new members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and recommending those names to the President because you're going to have the Vice Chairman, the Chairman, 2 service chiefs. You could have some combatant commanders turn over. So this is going to be a year of significant improvement in the quality of the leadership, as I mentioned. And so with that, Sean is probably, no one is better prepared for this job from the Naval Academy, from MIT, served for John Warner on the Armed Services Committee, Senate staffer, been in the acquisition job since the Bush administration, has the kind of continuity that we need more of in government in these areas. Huge improvements have happened. You know, all the press tends to focus on, you know, a few programs that are in trouble, but there's so much good going on in this area. So with that, thank you for allowing me to make these comments. And Sean, I hope that was a short enough introduction for you.
Well, thanks, Arnold. It's great to see so many familiar faces here this morning, and I appreciate the invitation to join you. First, I actually don't know how to tweet yet. but it concerns me when you talk about tweeting here. I'll do my best to help get Heidi up here in the near future. If I was going to write an introduction, I would simply say Stackley was a naval officer for 27 years. He had the great privilege of serving under Chairman Warnership's term as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and great thanks to Chairman Warner for having the opportunity to serve in this capacity today. You left one important critical milestone off of Chairman Warner's resume, which should not be lost on anyone here. I personally think it was a true capstone of his time in the Armed Services Committee, and that is the Webb-Lautenberg-Hagel-Warner GI Bill. It is a fantastic of all the legacies. That one will live for generations and engender in our service. Frankly, the benefits and rewards that should accompany the sacrifice that men and women in uniform are making. Yeah, this is a diverse audience, and I thought it'd be worthwhile to spend my time up here before we get to questions and discussions to give a broad brush of what's going on in our Navy and Marine Corps today. And I thought I'd start by I was asked, what's the title of your remarks? I don't give remarks titles, but after putting together some remarks, the title I would give this is Profound Simplicity, and just follow me here. A dozen years ago, upon dedicating the Systems Engineering Institute named in his honor at the Naval Postgraduate School, Admiral Meyer, affectionately referred to as the father of Aegis, summing up his 50 years experience in systems engineering, provided a classic tutorial on the subject, which he titled Profound Simplicity. He outlined fundamental rules for problem solving. First and foremost, when tackling the large, complex problems that we face in naval warfare, be sure to know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Large problems require large teams. So once the problem is understood, complex problems, communicate it clearly to the team and ensure that they work together tirelessly on the same problem. Then, each must plod daily, determinedly through the myriad of smaller, individual detail problems that form the larger problem. There needs to be one threat book that defines the threat that we're designing against. And in defining the threat, the technical requirements of each part of the system, known as cornerstones, those technical parts, they're inviolate. And every engineer on the team, he must know these cornerstones must not freelance, must support the achievement. And then finally, in dealing with uncertainty, time is your enemy. And inaction, because of any uncertainty, inaction could be deadly. Well, we have a large team, government and industry, represented by many of you here today, and we are working together tirelessly on some large problems, which I'd like to discuss. And for anyone that's looking for quick and easy solutions, well, they only come after plodding daily, determinedly through the myriad of smaller problems, which we're doing. As for the threat book, there are 3 threats in particular that keep me awake at night. First, the cost or rising costs of providing for our nation's defense. Second, an increasingly technologically capable adversary, potential or otherwise. And third, the Budget Control Act. So let me first make comment on our current budget posture. We are actually in a fortunate position of having both an authorizations and appropriations bill at the start of the calendar year. Escaping the extraordinary disruption of government shutdown, furloughs, extensive continuing resolutions, and sequestrations that we've experienced over the past few years gives us a measure of stability that enables far greater efficiency and effectiveness as we carry out our mission this year. In fact, the Department of the Navy has fared extremely well in this year's bills. Not only has Congress fully supported our request for ships, aircraft, and weapons, the committees added funding to increase procurement in our most critical programs, sending a very strong signal of support for our Navy Marine Corps mission. And in a few short weeks, having wrestled with the implications of the Budget Control Act, the implications of threats posed by nations that do not have a Budget Control Act, and the needs of our military to meet the requirements for our national security, we'll begin the process anew as we deliver our budget request to the Hill for fiscal year 2016. Now, at a more macro level, we are steadily, deliberately drawing down forces that have been involved for more than 13 years in predominantly land warfare. Throughout this period, from Rumsfeld to Gates to Panetta to Hagel, our top priority, rightfully, has been on winning the war we're in. Our warfighting ability, whether measured in end strength, number of armored vehicles, deployment to dwell ratios, steaming days, or flight hours, or that measure we most conveniently use, the defense budget itself, was significantly increased after 9/11 towards that end, with the great majority of the budget increase over this period going towards the needs of the ground forces in the fight. And meanwhile, throughout this period, beyond its role in supporting and sustaining the forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Navy has continued to pursue those missions that the nation has come to expect of a global Navy: maritime security, forward presence, crisis response, strategic deterrence. In fact, on any given day since 9/11, nearly half of our fleet has been underway, and of that number, 100 ships have steadily been on deployment. The demand for naval presence has risen as the Navy has taken on greater responsibility for missions ranging from sea-based missile defense, first in the Sea of Japan, and more recently in the Eastern Mediterranean, to anti-piracy in the Indian Ocean, and humanitarian assistance wherever disaster occurs, most recently marked by the role of the Aegis destroyer Samson and the littoral combat ship Fort Worth in the search for the remains of Air Asia Flight 8501. Now let me make some observations. First, I have to tell you what you already know, but something that should never be taken for granted. Ours is the most powerful naval force in the world. From the Standard missile fired from the vertical launchers on Aegis cruisers and destroyers, to Super Hornets launched from the deck of a Nimitz-class carrier, to precision strike by Tomahawks launched from the tubes of SSGNs, to persistent ISR, close inshore by Virginia submarines, or overhead by long-range patrol aircraft and unmanned systems, to amphibious assault by Marines launched from the back of an MV-22. Our sailors and Marines possess overmatching capability against today's threat throughout the world. Second, our superiority at sea demands that we maintain superiority in technology, science, engineering. Tens of thousands of engineers working across our systems commands, warfare centers, research centers, labs, and throughout like institutions in industry are working to develop the technologies and systems, perform the design and engineering, and ultimately build, test, and field the next generation capabilities that will ensure we maintain our superiority at sea. Just prior to the holidays, I had the opportunity to tour the DDG-1000 in construction at Bath Iron Works, followed the next day by a visit to get eyes on the air and missile defense radar in development at Raytheon. Incredible technology. From there, a short drive to Electric Boat, where the Navy and industry are developing the Virginia payload module to replace the strike capacity of the SSGNs as they retire next decade. While right down the hall from there, we're designing our highest priority program, the Ohio Replacement Submarine. Meanwhile, at Newport News, as we complete construction and testing of the remarkable first-of-class capabilities going to the CVN-78, the Gerald R. Ford, our first new design aircraft carrier since the Nimitz herself. We start construction of her sister ship, CVN-79, the John F. Kennedy. From the Gulf Coast to the West Coast, we're testing and fielding the latest increments of the Littoral Combat Ship mission packages. While off the coast of Hawaii, USS John Paul Jones is demonstrating the upgraded capabilities, air and missile defense capabilities of the Aegis weapon system. Meanwhile, get down to Pax River, and you'll get a look at fifth-generation capabilities of the Joint Strike Fighter, conducting developmental testing as the Marines ready for her initial operational capability milestone this summer. From these developments to the fielding of the SM-6 Standard Missile, the advanced Hawkeye aircraft, and the introduction of Navy Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, which will extend our air defense horizon far beyond today's radar horizon, to the first deployment of the P-8A Neptune aircraft and the first flight of the Navy's high-endurance unmanned aircraft, the Triton, which represent the next great leap forward in terms of maritime surveillance and anti-submarine warfare, all within this past year. To the ongoing development of the Shipboard Electronic Warfare Improvement Program, the Next Generation Jammer, the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, the Electromagnetic Railgun, and on and on. We, in fact, are continuing to develop, design, build, and test those next-generation capabilities. Third, we must improve our ability to rapidly respond to emerging threats that disrupt our kill chain. It's unacceptable that the development cycle for our major programs has evolved to a long, drawn-out series of development, design, build, test, and deliver phases that, left of its own accord, is unable to keep pace with a threat that has demonstrated the ability to exploit our vulnerabilities and do so in rapid fashion. Accordingly, we need to be able to go outside the traditional process to rapidly respond to the urgent needs of the combatant commander. We made progress in this area, putting our incredible government and industry talent to work. Some simple examples: the Office of Naval Research and the Applied Physics Lab and the Program Executive Office for Integrated Warfare Systems, they're tackling the DF-21D threat today. The Naval Research Lab has put to sea the Transportable Electronic Warfare Module in extraordinarily rapid response to an emerging cruise missile threat. The Applied Research Lab, working with the Program Executive Office for Submarines, cut the development timeline down by years for the surface ship torpedo defense system in order to deploy the first model on board George H.W. Bush for deployment this past year in the Gulf. ONR and the Naval Surface Warfare Center Dahlgren have fielded the Advanced Technology Laser Weapon System on board the 5th Fleet afloat base, the USS Ponce. And DARPA, working with the Aviation Weapons Program Executive Office, is on a fast track developing the long-range anti-ship missile in response to PACOM's #1 urgent need. These efforts add up to a great start, but we need to press on with our rapid prototyping and to harvest the lessons that come from our successes and our failures in order to compress the timeline for fielding those weapons needed to counter the emerging threats coming our way. Fourth, the budget is flat, or if we follow the law, the BCA, arguably the budget is going down. Forecasted budget levels are driving debate and trade-offs between current and future readiness, such that some would argue we're holding on to too much force structure. This creates an uphill climb for our Navy as we return to our much-needed requirement of 300 ships. The most poignant example of this is the dilemma that we're facing with the Ohio replacement program. The cost of replacing our sea-based strategic deterrent threatens to drive down the size of our fleet if we do not receive some form of top-line relief for shipbuilding. The Hill has been very critical of the Navy's long-range shipbuilding plan, questioning whether the Navy has ever seen a shipbuilding budget like that which we project for the decade of the 20s when we'll be building the Ohio replacement. And the simple answer is yes. The budget was at such level when, in fact, we built the Ohio itself. A fifth observation is that other navies are making significant investments in their warfighting capabilities, such that the maritime superiority that the U.S. has long maintained cannot be assumed in the decades ahead. China's investment in naval capabilities is particularly impressive. You've seen the press articles highlighting their progress in a new aircraft carrier, nuclear submarines, their fifth-generation fighter, amphibious capabilities, unmanned aircraft, and anti-ship cruise and ballistic missiles. Russia, too, is revitalizing its blue water Navy capabilities. So, given this handful of observations, what is the way ahead? Well, we cannot simply spend our way out of this situation. Today's pressure on the budget is not going to decline, but neither will the demand for increasingly capable weapon systems, which bring added cost. And so right alongside range and speed and payload and power, affordability has become a compelling requirement. There's not a major program, not even the Ohio replacement, which is left to define its requirement without a cost cap. And more than merely establishing cost caps, we're leveraging every tool in the toolbox, starting with the way we define requirements, conducting trades between capabilities and cost, leveraging mature technologies, maximizing competition, putting a lock on stability in our programs so industry can plan, invest, and produce more efficiently, and leveraging multi-year contracts to reduce our costs. On this note alone, 7 of the last 8 multi-year contracts authorized by Congress have been for Navy programs, saving billions and billions more to our budget. We need to maintain our warfighting advantage in those critical mission areas that underpin our national military strategy: strategic deterrence, air dominance, undersea dominance, strike, air and missile defense, expeditionary warfare. And this means placing a priority on those investments in the budget, and we're doing that. But we also need to up our game in warfare areas where we're falling behind or at risk of falling behind: cyber, electronic warfare, offensive surface warfare. This means increasing investment in these areas, and we're doing this too. We need to revisit the technology roadmap that will guide development of the sensors, networks, payloads, and warfare systems that tomorrow's Navy will rely upon to overcome the challenges of fighting at range against increasingly capable adversaries. Secretary Work has launched an effort to formulate what he's referred to as an offset strategy that will guide all of the Department of Defense in this regard. And Undersecretary Kendall is coordinating across all of the services to construct the long-range research and development plan, which will aid in this effort. And in doing so, we're taking a hard look at our way ahead in directed energy, unmanned systems, autonomy, stealth, electronic attack, precision, and penetrating strike to ensure we have a coherent strategy backed up by investments in our budget. And in doing so, while acquisition tends to focus on platforms or weapon systems, today's complex systems require a different approach. We need to engineer the entire kill chain: ballistic missile defense, Navy integrated fire control counter-air, mine warfare. These are prime examples of the results of muscling through the links, the interfaces, the interoperability issues which encumber these large, complex problems. We need to care for the health and strength of both our industrial base and our acquisition workforce. It is the large team that Admiral Meyer refers to. We need to consider our policies and practices and find opportunities to support both in a tough budget environment. When it comes to budget crunching, industrial-based policy and acquisition workforce are often mistaken as the soft stuff, which reminds me of Gordon England's comment once: the soft stuff is the hard stuff, and this hard stuff, it's paramount we get it right. Finally, we need to reverse sequestration. Recently, I had the opportunity to respond to requests from Senators McCain and Levin regarding acquisition. And 2, I've reviewed NDIA's pathway to transformation on the same topic. We broadly agree on the challenge, its complexity, and the types of action needed to improve our course. We need precious little new legislation that will trigger added bureaucracy to respond to new requirements levied against an already Byzantine process. My prayer for relief, much in line with NDIA's recommendation for a zero-based review, is that the Congress will first consider rolling back past legislation that encumbers our ability to do our jobs. More importantly, all of our efforts to improve efficiency are for naught if we do not address that most immediate legislative threat inside our horizon, sequestration. And as Admiral Meyer described, we need to work together tirelessly on this same problem, to operate from one threat book. For in dealing with this uncertainty, time clearly is our enemy, and inaction could be deadly. These are the things that keep me awake at night. And so for the time we have remaining, I'd like to hear what it is that keeps you all awake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. That, it must be said, was an exemplary defense industrial policy address. I can hardly think of a better, more complete one than that. Thank you very much for the time and effort that you and your staff obviously put into developing that. Unless this is something you just know off the cuff of your shirt all the time because you dream about it, apparently. Not sure which, but it was great.
Well, see, dreaming assumes that I sleep at night.
Ah, which we should not. All right, well, I'm going to start the conversation with some questions that come to my mind. Some of them were prompted by your address itself, and some of them are an effort, as those of you who've been to this event and like it before, to kind of draw your reaction to some themes that have been developing over the course of both this series as well as the Captains of Industry series that I talked about. A little bit of both. But before I do anything else, and as a setup to my first question, I need to correct the record. I misstated your proper title in my welcoming remarks. You are not the Assistant Secretary for AT&L. You are the Assistant Secretary for Research, Development, and Acquisition, which I was reminded of as you were talking. But that does set up the first question I have, and you nearly answered it at the end, but I wonder if you could elaborate. One of the new things within the last few months, not brand new obviously, but new points of emphasis within the department is innovation. Right, we have not only was that, I think, the strong point of Better Buying Power 3.0 as Frank Kendall promulgated it in the fall, but obviously also Secretary Hagel's remarks at the Reagan Forum announced this defense, capital D, capital, Defense Innovation Initiative. Are there, a two-part question more or less, which is, are there particular technologies, not programs, not systems, but technologies that we need a lot of work on in order to realize a real offset in competitive advantage? And should we expect to see, albeit the 2016 budget is embargoed, so I'm not going to try to draw you out more than I know you can go, but should we expect to see important change in the 2016 budget that is a reflection of this new emphasis on innovation technology?
Yeah, let me, first, innovation is not new.
Exactly.
This is not a new thing. This is increased emphasis on what we have been doing all along. You're going to get my perspective. I'm not speaking for Secretary of Work, obviously. A couple of things. One, you see Secretary of Work stepping forward with the offset strategy. He's drawing back from history. He's looking at past downturns in the budget following a period of long war, after World War II, after Vietnam, where the Department of Defense had to invoke something like an offset strategy to literally keep a focus on technology, advancement of technology, weaponization of technology, not for the near term, but for the long term, so that we do not inadvertently choke off those developments under budget pressure, and then the next generation, 10, 15 years from now, suffer from not having the advantage that we have with regards to our technological superiority on the battlefield. Our defense strategy is built around technological superiority, and we are at risk in tight times of suppressing that. So the offset strategy, the better buying power emphasis on not just innovation, but really going after the technologies that are going to be needed for the next generation weapon systems. This in part is to ensure that it retains the prominence it deserves in the budget when all the churn is going on around it. I marched through just the areas that are key to our strategy from the Navy Marine Corps perspective. Strategic deterrence. You see significant investment in terms of strategic deterrence going on right now associated with the high replacement program. Air dominance. We're talking air dominance beyond just what's going on with today's Joint Strike Fighter. We're looking, in fact, at the technologies that will be necessary beyond today's Joint Strike Fighter, the next generation aircraft, which may or may not be manned or unmanned. So there's a series of technologies that are going to be key enablers to that future warfighting capability. Air and missile defense will be with us for all time. We know that. And so the partnership between the services and the Missile Defense Agency to work on everything from sensor to weapon, links in between, command and control, those will continue to have a degree of prominence priority in terms of not just this near-term budget, but that offset strategy, that better buying power 3.0, and then inside of each of the services strategy. And for the Navy in particular, undersea dominance. We start to see parity forming up in other warfare areas. We don't see parity forming up in undersea dominance. And what we need to ensure is that we maintain our couple generation edge undersea. And that only comes by way of staying on top of the technology and making the right investments.
Can I, is it possible to identify a technological challenge that is particularly hard, that would be a real keystone to achieving a requirement or an operating concept that you know the warfighters would like, but is just a very hard problem right now?
I only have hard problems.
They're all hard, right? All your children are hard.
If you look at our, I'll talk Navy for a bit here. We talk about a 300-ship Navy, and we talk a lot about the rebalance to the Pacific. Well, if you do the math in a 300-ship Navy, and we have 100 ships deployed, how many of them, in fact, are deployed in key areas of interest in the Pacific? And now you're talking into numbers of dozens, not 300. That's a small percentage of the total force. So we have a challenge associated with time and distance, numbers at range, dealing with potential adversaries in that region. So we have to pursue the technologies that overcome those challenges when it comes to sensors, links, and weapon systems, which goes beyond just the platforms. We talk about ships, but as the CNO would quickly describe, it's not the platforms, it's the payloads. And that's where our focus has got to be when it comes to the technologies that we need to further. So now you're starting to get into things like unmanned systems. Directed energy has a lot of promise, but has a long way to go. We have a certain kill ratio that we're trying to overcome in terms of limited magazine capacities for that number of ships at that range. And then we've got strike off of the aircraft carrier. How do we best employ that critical asset on our battle force? So now when you start to bring the role of an unmanned aircraft melded into the air wing, how do we leverage its capabilities to get that force multiplier that we're looking for from unmanned?
And of course, affordability, we need an adjustment here apparently. Excuse us. Affordability, or more affordability, could also help address these time-distance disparities, right? So let me ask a question specifically on that. You mentioned, and when you did, it again invoked in my mind one of these themes that's been building over about a year of addresses like this, the payload module on the Virginia-class submarine. So although it's a little bit of either a cliched term or an esoteric one, modularity feels to my ears, I've heard, like something that is really different, that is really changing about our defense weapon systems and the way we acquire them, and frankly, the way industry is going to have to position itself to address the customer. Am I hearing that right? Is there something significant and different that goes under this catchphrase modularity going on?
I honestly think that this is more evolutionary. The first modules, frankly, were the Marines coming off of ships. Modularity, they're the first instantiation of modularity. Marines off of an amphib. The next are aircraft off of an aircraft carrier. The next breakthrough in terms of modularity was the vertical launch system, where we had a plethora of different launching systems that were plagued with their own reliability problems, and we landed on a vertical launch system. We made that standard, and now the module became the missile that interfaced with the VLS system. Mm-hmm. The next instantiation, big instantiation that you see, is the littoral combat ship, right, which in fact is built like a truck with command and control, and then the mission package became the module that you could swap out. The great advantage of modularity is, one is flexibility, two is you segregate the heavyweight platform from the lightweight payload, so that when you need modernization, upgrades, changeouts, you're not tying down the platform to that modernization, mm-hmm. which gives you much greater ability to modernize, keep pace with the threat, as opposed to tying the modernization to an aircraft carrier's depot cycle, right, or a cruiser.
You don't have to wait a whole generation every time you want to upgrade some capability. Yeah. So that actually brings to my mind another question. Another element of leverage on affordability or capability, depending on what side of the question you're starting from, are commercial technologies potentially. And again, this is another of these themes over a year and a half of addresses like this. Again, am I hearing it right? Is that something new and different and important, the introduction or integration of commercial technologies into defense weapons systems, or is it more of the same?
I don't think it's very new. Folks that were here in the early 90s and were paying attention, there was a big shift to go away from mil-spec to commercial standards. It was as much due to necessity as it was due to desire. Mm-hmm. And that's a double-edged sword. But by leveraging commercial, you're able to leverage that broad marketplace, that innovation, all the benefits that come with affordability in the commercial marketplace versus a unique military industrial base. Mm-hmm. So what you're hearing is renewed emphasis on identifying those opportunities where we can tap into the commercial base, employ that technology for our military systems. And it is a bit on fire today in a good way in terms of computing systems. We have gone away, we're long removed from mil-spec computing systems. Now we're at the stage where the intense demands for computing power by our complex weapon systems are able to be met by commercial hardware, mm-hmm. inside of a militarized cabinet with military unique software for the mission. Mm-hmm. So there's a hybrid model out there that we're employing that gives us the ability to leverage the affordability, keep pace with the threat, upgrade on a more periodic basis than what we were able to do in the past.
Is there any, or at least Arnold made reference to the change of command, at least in the Senate, and of Congressman Thornberry's ascendancy to the chairmanship of the House. Is there any, are there legislative barriers, any things you'd like to get rid of, or some authorities you need in order to better access commercial technologies?
I honestly don't believe we need much authority in that regard.
Okay.
We have a team that's looking specifically at what is necessary for us to greater leverage commercial opportunities, but nothing quickly comes to mind in terms of requiring legislative authorities.
Or any please get out of the ways either.
Well, that's a different thing.
Well, I thought I'd ask that as well.
Yeah. There are some restrictions that we're going to have to sit down with the Congress and discuss regarding basically our acquisition regulations that flow down from statute. We're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to determine can we or can we not go after this particular technology with this barrier in place. Today, though, that is not the great hurdle before us.
Okay. I also want to then now tie together, and then momentarily I will open the conversation for questions from the audience, but I want to tie these two themes of commercial technology and modularity together and draw into relief, if it's not for everyone in the room, at least in my eyes, the P8A acquisition strategy. I know Frank Kendall has called it out as some sort of exemplar of the better buying power principles, and I certainly, for what it's worth, admire it as well. I wonder if I can just draw you out on that. You know, what was successful, or what is proving to be successful? First of all, what was that acquisition strategy, and why did you undertake it, and is it working?
Okay, so the legacy aircraft that we use for maritime patrol is the P-3 Orion. It's about a 40-plus-year-old aircraft that is basically nearing the end of its service life. In preparing to replace it, the path the Navy went on was, rather than design, develop, build, and test a new militarized aircraft, let's tap into that commercial marketplace. And what we chose was the Boeing 737, probably the most prolific aircraft around the world today. And that relieved us from that part of our design and development cycle, where we could instead focus our energies and our talents on the mission system that we're going to employ for maritime patrol and ASW. So you end up with a hybrid of a commercial aircraft, all the affordability that brings, all the global support that brings, and then a unique military set of hardware for carrying out that unique mission that the P-8 called out to do. It's given us affordability. It's given us speed in terms of the time required to replace the P-3. It is a game changer in terms of the ASW mission that aircraft will perform with its flight profile. And equally important, we, the government, are the systems integrator for the systems that we're going to employ on the aircraft. And we have the ability to keep it modernized, keep it updated on a much tighter periodicity than we were able to with the P-3, which will ensure that we're able to keep pace with the threat. That P-3 model, or P-8 model, we're employing as much as possible across the board. We want to reuse technology where it applies. We want to tap into mature technology where it applies. Recently, this past year, the Department of the Navy made a determination that we have another amphibious shipbuilding program coming our way to replace what's referred to as the LSD-41 class. Why do we need to go down the path of designing, developing, and building a new platform when what we want is a certain lift fingerprint that the Marine Corps requires to go to war? Tap into a mature program where we understand the costs, the LPD-17, and let's modify that platform to meet the mission of the LSD-41. That's what we're doing. When it came time to replace the presidential helicopter, that earlier canceled program, canceled when Secretary Gates took office, that was a very unique helicopter that we are designing and developing for that unique mission. But what we've determined is we don't need a unique platform. We need unique mission systems and capabilities, but we can tap into other already certified aircraft. And in fact, we ran a competition and awarded to Sikorsky a program that leverages an existing aircraft off of their production line. And now what we do is outfit it with the necessary mission systems and capabilities required for the presidential mission.
With respect to those last two examples, is the Navy going to be its own systems integrator?
Absolutely.
So for a guy who remembers pretty strongly 12 years ago when the advent of a large systems integrator, LSI, was all the rage, this feels like an important trend line. A back to the future, if you will, for someone like you who has a long historical memory of the service itself, integrating major systems.
Yeah, it's, we have to grow into that role. In the 90s, we downsized. Our acquisition workforce was cut by greater than 40%. And then to get back into the role as being the systems integrator, which is what we used to be, we've had to develop the talent. We've had to make sure that we're ready to take over the specific responsibilities before we just launch into it. And then we have to be selective to ensure that what the tasks that we're taking on are rightful for the government as opposed to industry. And we're going about that carefully but deliberately.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions from the audience. We have 20 minutes within which to do it. I'll start right here. This gentleman. Please stand up. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Thanks very much for your remarks, sir. You mentioned Congress is being supportive in this past budget. Of course, sometimes they're supportive perhaps to a fault from the Navy's perspective. They're saying you can't get rid of or set aside the cruisers. They say you must acquire one more LPD-17 and give you almost enough money to buy it, but not quite. And they say you absolutely are going to refuel the George Washington, but again, all this runs into whether there'll be the money to keep the ship in service. So looking at those mandates from Congress, those strong desires from Congress, and especially the prospect of sequestration, how do you square that circle? How do you keep the force structure and yet not sacrifice all the other things as the budget potentially crunches?
Okay, let me start with Congress's responsibility. Okay, Article 1, Section 8 is the responsibility of the Congress to provide and maintain a Navy. Okay, so we submit a President's budget request, but it's the ultimate responsibility of the Congress to pass back a budget to us. And each of those examples that you just described go right to the heart of requirements versus budget. Let me start with the CVN 73. The Navy's requirement is for 11 aircraft carriers, 10 air wings. The question of whether or not we can afford to refuel the CVN 73, the George Washington, hinges around the question of, are we going to suffer sequestration? So the Navy submitted a budget that anticipates sequestration in 2016. And what it put on the table for the Congress to deliberate on was whether or not we can afford to go down to 10 carriers, or whether or not we can afford to refuel the George Washington in the face of sequestration. The commitment through that budget process was we're going to go forward and refuel that ship. We have a requirement for 11 aircraft carriers. There is uncertainty associated with sequestration. The budget summit forced the debate. We're going to go forward and refuel that ship. We need that capacity, that capability. It's not just the carrier, it's the air wing that goes with it. The second example is the LPD-28. The Marine Corps has done plenty of lift analyses that describe what amount of lift that they require to meet their requirements for amphibious operations. And the answer is we need more amphibious ships than we've got today. The specific answer is we need a mix of 38 amphib ships. The CNO and the Commandant have agreed to accept risk in terms of the size of amphibious force, and so our requirement in our long-range plan is for 33 amphibious ships, and today we sit at 29. So however you want to measure the requirement, today we are below the requirement for amphibious lift. The LPD-17 program was originally a 12-ship class. The Navy has procured 11 of those ships, and the last of those ships is in production today. As we look ahead to the LXR, which this past year we have determined we're going to reuse that LPD-17 hull form, we've got a gap in amphibious ship construction. That's a problem for the industrial base. So you start to add this up, we've got a requirement for more amphibs than we have today in the force. We have a gap in the industrial base that will cause challenges when it comes time to build that next amphibious ship class, the LXR. And we've got a challenge in terms of being able to afford another LPD in the face of sequestration. So Congress has tried to make that challenge something the size of which we can handle in our 2016 budget by adding funding towards a 12th LPD. So that to me is Congress doing Congress's job. The third example was the cruisers. I characterize the cruiser situation very different. As we look forward to the issues associated with sequestration and the absolute need to modernize those cruisers to get their full service life, we can't do them both. We cannot modernize those cruisers in the face of sequestration unless we do something different. And the thing that we are looking to do different frankly, is to take the cruiser force, and when we put it into a modernization, we plan to put it into an extended modernization period so we can actually demand the crew during that period and cut the cost associated with manning the crew while the ship's in the depot and use those savings to go towards the modernization effort. That was our plan. What Congress did not like was the pace at which we were going to execute that. Because our plan was take 22 cruisers, tag 11 of those to our carrier battle groups. The other 11, let's go ahead and put those in depot modernization now, decrew those, use those savings to go towards the modernization, and then replace the first 11, one for one as they retire, with the modernized cruisers, so we keep a cruiser tied to every battle group. Congress did not like the rate at which we were going to do that, so they did something different. They gave us partial authority. They gave us the authority to ramp up our modernization program, and they gave us funding specifically tied to that modernization plan so that that funding would not be subjected to the threat of sequestration. So in each of those examples, I see the Congress and the Department of Defense discussing our requirements, debating how we can afford those requirements under the threat of sequestration, and Congress exercising its responsibilities and giving us direction or funding back on how to ensure that we in fact have the Navy that we require to meet our national security. Okay?
Thank you. There's a question right there. A gentleman with the beard actually in front of Tony. We'll get to you, Tony.
Good afternoon. My name is Jack Curtis. I'm a staffer with Senator Mark Warner's office. One of the points you touched on was having a more capable enemy. Is there any specific threat you could point to in the next 3 to 5 years that you say this presents the greatest threat to the Navy's mission?
Okay, I've got to be careful here. I'll just use what you already see in the press. Okay, there is a lot of investment by other navies in a thing that we call A2AD, access denial, area denial, and anti-access aerial denial. Well, that poses a challenge for our Navy operating half the world away. And the threats that they are developing, the way that they are going after our kill chain, okay? The kill chain is not just the ship. The kill chain is the sensor. The kill chain is the weapon. The kill chain is the link in between. The kill chain is what's overhead. The way that they're going after trying to exploit our vulnerabilities, that creates challenges for us. And so a key part of our investment strategy is to shore up our kill chain while likewise studying theirs to flip the equation. Okay?
There's a question from a young woman right here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Lara Seligmann. I'm a reporter for Inside the Navy. So I know the GAO recently did a report criticizing the new carrier program, particularly CVN 78 and 79 for cost overruns. So can you tell me, do you have concerns that the cost is going to continue to grow for those programs over the next couple of years, particularly as the ship enters the new critical parts of its development?
Boy, I'd say, how much time do we have?
Quite literally 10 minutes.
Let me just give you facts. The Navy identified where the cost on the CVN 78 was going when the ship was about 20% complete. We could see where this was going. There's the CVN 78. Originally, the program was going to be this thing called the CVN 21. It was going to be the next carrier program after the Nimitz class. It was going to be an incremental 3-carrier development of capabilities. So we're going to step our way up to this thing called the CVN 21 over 3 platforms. It was decided about 15 years ago that that was not transformational enough. I worry about the word transformation. It was not transformational enough. So instead, we were directed, you're going to do this in one step called the CVN 78. So we had significant developmental efforts that were going to be combined, rather than incrementally, onto a single platform, the CVN 78. All new reactor plant, all new electrical power distribution, 10 million feet of cable to deal with some very unique systems, electromagnetic aircraft launching, advanced arresting gear, dual band radar, increased survivability, technologies that would allow us to reduce the crew, ship, and air debt by 1,200 people per carrier. $4 to $5 billion savings per carrier over its life cycle. Significant leap forward in terms of technologies, but also in terms of risk, all being brought to bear on a single carrier, the CVN-78. So when the ship is about 20 to 25%, we're starting to see a lot of those risks turn into costs. Cost, not just cost risk, but cost forecasts. And we notified the Congress. And in August 2011, we put down, here's what our cost estimate is for completing the aircraft carrier. It had a cost cap, so it would require Congress to give us relief in terms of that new cost estimate. Our number hasn't changed since August of 2011. It has not changed. Now, does that mean there's not pressure? Does that mean there isn't risk? Absolutely there is, and we're managing it every day. We are plotting daily, determinedly, to deal with those smaller problems to solve the larger problem every single day. We've got the team that's suited for it, government and industry. That's a CVN-78. I wrote the number down, $12.887 billion in August of 2011. I've sent that by letter to the Hill every single month. I send them a monthly report on how we're doing. It is going to be hard right up to the very end, but we're going to get it done. That's the CVN-78. The CVN-79 also has a cost cap, $11.498 billion. Does it have cost pressure on it? Certainly. We haven't finished the first ship, so clearly the second ship is going to have risk until you've actually completed the first one. What are we doing about that? We're going about that in a big way. The CNO and I sit down with the program executive officer and the sponsor on a monthly basis, going over spreadsheets about 4 feet long, line item by line item, small font, in terms of the cost of every element that adds up to that aircraft carrier to drive cost out, to drive accountability in, so that today we're not accepting an $11.498 billion cost estimate for that carrier. We're driving that number down to ensure that in execution, as things happen, if things happen that affect its cost, we have plenty of headroom to not just stay below that cost cap, but to keep the cost down in a more affordable region for the aircraft carrier. And CVN-80 will do better yet.
By the way, in the most recent speaker in the Captains of Industry series, as many of you may know, was Mike Petters, the Chief Executive Officer of Huntington Ingalls. And he got that question, and unless I'm mistaken, he had a very, very similar, if not exactly the same answer.
If he didn't, I'm going to tattoo it on the inside of his eyelid, so every time he blinks, he's reminded of it.
I think he's got you covered. All right, right there, please, gentleman with the glasses, whom I previously referred to as Tony.
Hi, sir. Tony Capascio with Bloomberg News. Sean, can you talk a little bit about the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund that Congress so generously gave you? It seems like a Navy bailout fund, and it implies that none of your SCN money is going to be used for this potential massive budget buster, but other services are going to pay for it. Can you walk us through the intent?
Let me just state to the facts, Tony. I'll leave the editorial aside for a second, okay? Yeah, I described in my remarks the challenges that we've got. If you put the Ohio replacement program aside for a second, you know, the Secretary of the Navy has been almost singular of purpose, okay? He has been so focused on getting us back to that 300-ship Navy, it has just driven goodness throughout industry and the Navy, all right? Today we're at 289. Where were we a couple years ago? 274. Where are we going to be in 2019? We're going to be at 300, okay? And the reality is today we've got 44 ships under construction. We've got another dozen under contract. We've got another 8 under contract here in 2015. Those ships are not going to be taken away from us in sequestration. We're on a path to 300 ships. We're going to get there. That's at a shipbuilding conversion Navy budget number of about, let's just call it about $15 billion a year, which includes everything from RCOHs to post-delivery and outfitting. That's what our top line has been for the last roughly 15 odd years. The Ohio replacement program, depending on how you want to measure it, which year dollars, it's about a $100 billion thing, okay? It's 12 Ohio replacement submarines over about a 15-year period. We need to be building these. That first one, 2021. We procure it. 2029, we complete it. 2031, I can tell you what month and day it's going to be on deployment. It is going to be on deployment. That is our number one priority. That is a national mission. And we have to procure those at a 1-for-1 rate to replace the current Ohios as they retire. And you cannot extend the service life of an Ohio submarine. It's been done. So we're at the limits. So that poses a significant impact to our shipbuilding budget. That would, over that period of time, it represents $5, $6, up to $7 billion increase in any particular year through the decade of the 20s. As I said in my remarks, when was the last time we ever saw shipbuilding numbers in that range? Well, it was when we built the Ohio. It is a national mission, and the nation at that period of time determined we need to increase our shipbuilding accounts. We need to get this submarine built and out to sea. We are facing the same challenge. So the authorizers, we don't have the solution today, okay? But a step in the right direction, okay, is to acknowledge that we've got a challenge here. We've got to start to put the tools in place to deal with that challenge. It's inside of our fit-up. This isn't something that's far down the road. It's inside of our fit-up in terms of dealing with that cost and its impact on shipbuilding. So by putting in the Sea-Based Strategic Deterrent Fund, you understand they put in a fund. They did not put money in the fund, okay? It is a fund. It is an account that still has to, it's a zero sum. We still have to get money funded into that account. And so the sources of the money is still in question. So while I call this a good first step, we've got a long way to go to resolve the issue. The good news is Congress and the Department of Defense are working closely together, first recognizing the challenge, and two, we're at least years in front of it so that it's not right a fire on our doorstep when we have to deal with it. And this year, and again next year, and the year after. You might call it a debate. I'm going to call it a very important discussion between the Congress and the Department on how we're going to be able to fund the Ohio. We're going to fund the Ohio replacement. That is not in the balance. The question is, how do we maintain the balance of our shipbuilding program as we fund the Ohio replacement? And that's why that fund that the authorizers have established, I call a good first step. Okay?
That is terrific. I'm afraid, as I promised I would do, we're going to draw this to a close right at 12:15. But before we do, and before I thank Sean, did you have any closing remarks that you wanted to add?
I think I probably spent all my rounds. I'll just one last comment, and this is I made mention to responding to Senators McCain and Levin and the NDIA report. My response was fairly short. I spent a lot of time. Okay, here we go again. How do you answer the question? How do you fix acquisition? And two key conclusions I drew. One, we really don't need more legislation. We don't. And I can't exactly explain why, but I know that any legislation we get is going to beget more bureaucracy, which will have the exact opposite effect from what was desired. But two, and the thing that I landed on, and you can't lose sight of this, is what works and what doesn't work. When I think back on the programs where we have had great success, where we either have broken through, done things that have never been done before, overcome extraordinary challenges, what is constant through all of them is great people in charge. Great people in charge of those programs, people that know their stuff, and people that aren't looking to have somebody tell them what their authorities are, people that are grabbing the authority that they need and going and getting the job done. Where we've had challenges, where we have fallen, stumbled, and had to do over again, that's where we didn't quite have that team in place. So my response to Congress was, please, don't give us more, give us less in terms of legislation. Let's talk about rolling back. But come what may, no matter how difficult the system is that we have to work through, in, and around, good people can get it done. Good people can get it done. So that's where our focus is, on getting good people in the key jobs throughout acquisition to get these tough jobs done.
Thank you. I dare say it would be hard to have found a 75-minute module of time when we could have enjoyed as thorough and comprehensible a status report on Navy research, development, and acquisition. Thanks very much. I'm sure you did not make your last remarks to set me up to say this, but I think the 75 minutes also testifies to the fact that one of the great people in charge, at least in the Navy, is Sean Stackley. Thank you very much. Thank you.